interests of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Sweden, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Khaled Khiari, Assistant Secretary General, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Ms. Joyce Masuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. Invitation under Rule 39. Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure. I also invite Her Excellency Ms. Hedda Samson, Deputy Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Khaled Khiari.
Madam President, since we last briefed this Council on developments in Ukraine, we have seen an alarming escalation of fightings, while there was no significant diplomatic progress. Russian attacks continue to intensify, with mounting civilian casualties and devastation across Ukraine. On 9th of April, following Ukraine's earlier proposal of an Easter ceasefire, the Russian Federation announced a 32-hour Easter truce from 11 to 12 April. Ukraine responded that it would reciprocate. We welcome initiatives, even a limited one, that will bring respite for the civilian population. We regret, however, that this temporary pause in fighting that could have allowed a peaceful celebration of Orthodox Easter was not respected. Hostilities close to the front lines and resulting civilian casualties were reported throughout the holiday weekend. Attacks quickly escalated thereafter. 3 consecutive nights of Russian aerial strikes between 13 and 16 of April targeted multiple regions across Ukraine and resulted in dozens of civilians killed and injured. On the night from 15 to 16 April, the Russian Federation launched its deadliest attack so far this year, targeting Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Kyiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv regions. In the city of Odessa and Dnipro, residential buildings were hit, reportedly killing at least 9 and 5 people respectively. In total across the country, at least 20 people, including at least 1 child, were reportedly killed and dozens more injured by this attack. Madam President, of greatest concern is the ever-increasing loss of civilian life resulting from continued attacks. Last month alone, at least 211 civilians were killed and 1,206 injured in Ukraine, according to the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights. In total, since February 2022, OCHR has verified that at least 15,578 Ukrainian civilians, including 784 children, have been killed. Another 43,352, including 2,668 children, have been injured. In the Russian Federation, local authorities, including in the Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk regions bordering Ukraine, have reported increasing civilian casualties. In one of the latest incidents on 16 April, a woman and a teenage girl were reportedly killed in an Ukrainian strike in Krasnodar region of the Russian Federation. Madam President, Ukraine's critical civilian infrastructure continues to be hit. Ukraine's Danube and Black Sea ports were reportedly targeted over the past month. These ports are critical to enable the export of Ukraine agricultural products, at a time of increasing concern over global food insecurity. Russian attacks on Ukraine's railway infrastructure have also continued, including today. In central Lviv, UNESCO heritage sites have once again come under fire. As of March 2026, UNESCO has verified damage to a total of 519 cultural sites since the start of the war. Civilian and energy infrastructure in the Russian Federation has also reportedly been hit during this period. Attacks on civilians and civil infrastructure are clearly prohibited under international humanitarian law. They must stop immediately, wherever they occur. Madam President, we welcome the exchange of prisoners of war that brought at home 175 service members and 7 civilians from each side on 11 April. 163 of the returned Ukrainians has reportedly been held captive since 2022. In interviews conducted by Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, many recently released Ukrainian prisoners reported that instances of torture has decreased or ceased in 2025 and 2026. However, all of them say that they had been subject to torture or ill treatment during their captivity. We remind each side of their obligations under international humanitarian law in their treatment of prisoners of war. And we again urge the Russian Federation to grant the United Nations unimpeded access to all detainees. The latest prisoner exchange was the 72nd since the start of the war. We commend all involved in facilitating these exchanges and urge the efforts to continue for the sake of those held captive and their relatives. Madam President, we urge all involved to redouble their efforts to return all deported and forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. The United Nations is committed to supporting this critical and urgent work. As part of these efforts and the implementation of her mandate, the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict has just concluded her first visit to Ukraine. Madam President, on Sunday, 26 April, we will mark 40 years since the devastating Chernobyl disaster, the most serious nuclear accident to ever occur, the impact of which is still felt today. This anniversary also serves as a warning of the scale of destruction we could witness in case of another incident, intended or unintended, while the war continues to endanger Ukraine's nuclear sites, especially the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear facility in Europe. It is imperative that all military activities near nuclear sites cease immediately. We also urge both sides to fully cooperate with the ongoing efforts by the International Atomic Energy Agency to ensure safe and secure operations of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, including its access to uninterrupted power supply. Madam President, 5 years in, the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine continues to test international law, drive deepening divisions, and undermine the broader rules-based multilateral order. Beyond the immediate conflict zone, the war has heightened regional tensions and insecurity, with drones reportedly sighted this month in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland. We must remain steadfast in our commitment to ending this war, guided by the principle and obligations set out in the United Nations Charter. Building on the efforts undertaken by the United States, it is essential that the international community maintain sustained attention and coordinated diplomatic engagement aimed at securing a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. Such efforts must lay the foundations for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in accordance with the United Nations Charter, international law, and the relevant resolution of the United Nations. We cannot afford the risk of the conflict spiraling out of control with ever higher human costs and unpredictable consequences for us all. The United Nations stands ready to support all meaningful initiatives that can help bring an end to the suffering and advance the prospects for peace. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Khiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Msuya.
Madam President, Excellencies, building on the political and security developments outlined by my colleague, Assistant Secretary General Khiari, let me highlight the humanitarian realities we are seeing across Ukraine. Since we last briefed this council 1 month ago, attacks have intensified and civilians continue to bear the brunt. Missile, drone, and artillery strikes have hit residential areas, public transport, energy systems, and port infrastructure. Hostilities over the weekend caused civilian casualties and damage to homes and other civilian infrastructure on both sides of the front line. A massive wave of overnight strikes last week affecting Dnipro, Kiev, and Odessa killed over 21 civilians and injured over 140 people. The week before, a strike hitting a public bus in Nikopol in broad daylight killed 4 people and injured 16 more. Homes damaged once are hit again. Schools and essential services remain under immense strain. Damage to energy infrastructure has created a systemic shock, disrupting electricity, water, heating, and essential services on which millions depend. Power outages on both sides of the front line are compounding hardship for already vulnerable communities. Hostilities are increasingly affecting urban residential areas. The geographic spread of strikes is widening. Damage to key access routes is further constraining civilian movement and limiting the reach of humanitarians. Madam President, continued damage to energy infrastructure is expected to have far-reaching humanitarian consequences through the summer months and into the next winter season. International humanitarian law is clear. Civilians and the infrastructure essential to their well-being must be protected. Medical facilities, energy systems, and water services on which civilians depend must be spared. Attacks that disrupt these systems deepen humanitarian needs and prolong human suffering. Humanitarian partners are supporting urgent repairs to energy networks, housing, health services, and water systems, while preparing for summer pressures and the next and 5th winter since the 2022 escalation of this war. Madam President, humanitarian needs remain vast even as diplomatic efforts continue. Despite ongoing hostilities, we and our partners continue to support communities close to the front line wherever access allows. Mobile teams continue to provide healthcare, mental health, and psychosocial support and other essential services. Just last week, an interagency convoy facilitated by OCHA delivered essential hygiene supplies to more than 600 people, including children and older persons, in a frontline community in Mykolaiv Oblast, exposed to constant shelling. Another interagency convoy reached Kherson. Humanitarian partners also continue to help evacuate people from frontline communities. In recent days, hundreds of civilians, including many children, have been assisted to reach safer locations and supported through transit centers. However, our access remains constrained in some areas due to the intensity of hostilities, and many vulnerable civilians still remain in areas close to the front line. Madam President, the growing use of armed drones is creating a daily dilemma for humanitarian actors: how to remain present where needs are greatest while keeping their staff safe. To teams regularly report drone strikes affecting their operations. Humanitarians must be protected and their work facilitated so they can provide relief to civilians in need wherever they are located in accordance with humanitarian principles. As we have repeatedly underscored before this Council, respect for the rules of war and the protection of civilians is not optional. It is a legal obligation. Madam President, the Global Humanitarian Overview, launched last December, is a snapshot in time. In Ukraine, however, needs continue to evolve and increase. Humanitarian partners are prioritizing those facing the greatest risk, but needs continue to outpace resources. Of the 10.8 million people requiring humanitarian assistance this year, millions remain beyond our reach. Nearly 3/4 of the $2.3 billion needed to assist the targeted 4.1 million people, nearly 1 in every 8 Ukrainians remain unfunded. That's almost $1.7 billion still to be funded. The regional refugee response also requires substantial funding. The paucity of funding has direct consequences for people's lives. It determines whether communities can access essential services, whether displaced families can access shelter support, whether people living close to the front line can receive life-saving assistance before conditions deteriorate further. Without early and sustained financial contributions, humanitarians are forced to scale back assistance precisely when needs are surging. Timely funding reduces vulnerability. Delayed funding increases it. Madam President, my 3 asks are not new, but they remain urgent. First, use your influence to ensure respect for international humanitarian law and accountability when it is violated. As the Interagency Standing Committee underscored last week in a joint statement on ending impunity, even wars have rules. Civilians, including humanitarian personnel and the critical infrastructure on which civilians depend, must be protected. Second, and connected to the first, ensure safe, rapid, unimpeded, and sustained humanitarian access to civilians in need across all areas of Ukraine, including those living in areas currently under the control of the Russian Federation. We must be able to reach all civilians, including and especially in areas close to the front line in need. Third, provide timely funding. Delays reduce what can be delivered and prolong hardship for civilians. For millions of people across Ukraine, the impact of the war is very real and constant. Protection, access, and timely financial contributions are a lifeline for the most affected people as efforts toward a just and lasting peace continue. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Chiari and ASG Msuya for their briefings. Madam President, over the past month, Russia has launched some of the most vicious attacks of its barbaric war of aggression against Ukraine. During Orthodox Easter, Ukrainian civilians had only 32 hours free from terror. One night without Russia's long-range drones, missiles, and guided bombs. Predictably, yet regrettably, since then, the Russian leadership has escalated its barbaric brutality. Just 9 hours after our last Security Council meeting on Ukraine on 23rd of March was over, Russia launched the largest drone attack ever recorded in the history of modern warfare. In 24 hours, 948 drones struck Ukrainian cities. As verified by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, this attack killed at least 6 people and injured almost 100. The strikes also hit a maternity hospital and damaged a 16th century monastery, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. March marked yet another record month of civilian casualties, most occurring in Ukrainian cities and towns far away from the front line. And deplorably, on 16 April alone, Russia once again launched over 700 drones and missiles against Ukrainian cities, killing at least 20 people and injuring over 100 in its deadliest attack this year. Since February 2022, Russia has launched a staggering number of aerial attacks against Ukraine, at least 94,344 long-range strike drones and missiles. As verified by World Health Organization, Russia has conducted at least 2,881 attacks affecting healthcare facilities, ambulances, and medical warehouses in Ukraine. Madam President, Russia, a permanent member of this Council with a special responsibility to uphold the UN Charter, continues to wage an unprovoked and illegal war against Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. Russia is deliberately causing global security and economic crisis, plus enabling and assisting Iranian attacks against our GCC partners. Meanwhile, Ukraine is actively helping the Gulf countries defend themselves against attacks by Iran, the same kind of attacks Ukrainians know so well. The Kremlin can try to hide the truth about the real costs and losses of this war from the Russian people by imposing internet blackouts, banning digital platforms, and repressing independent media. But Russia cannot hide the truth from the world. The world knows the imperial motives and the brutal reality of Russia's war. This is shown by the widespread support for Ukraine's General Assembly resolution on the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. Madam President, let Russia and its allies remember, accountability for all atrocities is not optional. It doesn't have an expiration date. And Latvia is committed to being one of the founding members of the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, as well as the International Claims Commission for Ukraine. 20 countries in total have already committed to joining the Special Tribunal, and we urge all countries to defend the fundamental principles of international law and demand accountability. Russia continues to deny access to the United Nations and independent monitors to the occupied territories in Ukraine and to Russia itself. The available verified reporting documents the grave and systematic crimes committed against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. These weeks, the whole UN celebrates the indigenous peoples. And I would like to draw attention to the Crimean Tatars, the indigenous peoples of the occupied Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine. This Muslim community already faced mass deportations by the Soviet regime. Thousands of them returned to a free Ukraine and a free Crimea. But this all changed in 2014. They are facing ethnic, political, and religious persecution and currently make up the majority of the political prisoners in Crimea. To conclude, Madam President, Russia's war is an imperial war. It is a war against the Ukrainian nation and its freedom. It is aimed at destroying the Ukrainian state, culture, history, and language. Russia can end this war and the civilian suffering immediately. If Ukraine stopped defending itself, it would be the end of Ukraine. This is why Latvia firmly stands with Ukraine, its sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. Latvia supports all peace efforts, especially under the leadership of the United States and European countries, to bring just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. An immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire is the first step. and we call on all countries to exert maximum pressure on Russia so it meaningfully engages in the peace process. And thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me thank Assistant Secretary General Khiari and Assistant Secretary General Masuya for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine to this meeting. And I wish to express my deepest condolences to the families of the victims in the horrible shooting in Kyiv this past weekend. Madam President, our brief and sobering accounts remind us that while the eyes of the world may be on the Middle East, the longest war on European soil since the World War II continues, away from the headlines, but no less devastating for Ukraine's civilians. This past month has marked some grim milestones. 1,500 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and 4 years since unveiling the horrors of Russia's brutal massacre in Bucha, which Denmark joined its EU partners in Bucha to commemorate on 31st March. In the past weeks, we witnessed, however, a faint and sadly fleeting glimmer of hope. Following repeated calls by Ukraine, Russia announced a 32-hour Easter ceasefire. There was an exchange of prisoners, and the Ukrainian authorities declared that its forces would only respond if there were Russian strikes. That hope, however, was instantly undermined as the Ukrainian authorities reported thousands of ceasefire violations throughout the 32-hour period. This tells us, once again, that the international community should not be persuaded by empty declarations. We should only be persuaded by actions, and these actions tell a different and desperate story, one of deflection rather than any meaningful step towards peace. Madam President, this cynicism by the Kremlin that we witnessed with the so-called Easter ceasefire is not new. For over a year, Kyiv has been offering an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire. But now it's clear that this is the essential first step towards a just and lasting peace. Russia, on the other hand, has time and time again chosen escalation over good faith engagement. Over the last month, Russian strikes continued to rain down over Ukraine's cities and along the front line. The UN reports that civilian casualties increased by 49% from February to March alone. The mass drone and missile attacks last week killed at least 20 civilians and injured up to 100, revealing a new and increasingly deadly Russian tactics. Drones with jet engines and daytime attacks immediately following nighttime attacks, making the strikes on heavily populated areas even more deadly. Madam President, Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians have been a feature of the full-scale invasion since the earliest days. Justice will come for the victims across Ukraine, those who died in mass killings, those who endured torture, sexual violence, and forced deportations. And it will come for the survivors who carried physical and mental scars every day. We will not forget them, and we will not abandon them. There must be accountability for the international crimes committed by Russia in this brutal campaign to destroy an independent Ukraine. Denmark fully supports the efforts by the International Criminal Court and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, as well as the work to create a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine and an International Claims Commission for Ukraine. Madam President, in closing, around this table, we need to be clear in calling this a war of choice. We call again on President Putin to finally end the war that he started. We do so, however, fully aware that so far there are no signs of his willingness to choose peace. We therefore also call on the international community to increase pressure to finally end the killing and destruction, to support a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. Anything less would be a failure of our responsibility. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Madame la Présidente, je remercie tout d'abord Monsieur le sous-secrétaire général aux affaires politiques, Khaled Khiari, et Madame la sous-secrétaire générale aux affaires humanitaires, Joyce Msuya, pour leurs interventions édifiantes. Elle nous rappelle, ces interventions, s'il en était besoin, qu'à l'heure où le cessez-le-feu au Moyen-Orient et au Liban permet de travailler à la construction de la paix, la Russie, qui mène une guerre d'agression contre l'Ukraine depuis plus de 4 ans, refuse le cessez-le-feu immédiat, complet et inconditionnel que la communauté internationale demande. Loin de constituer un pas en direction d'une paix juste et durable, la très éphémère trêve pascale, qui n'a pas été respectée le long de la ligne de front, a laissé place à des frappes russes acharnées sur l'ensemble du territoire ukrainien. Dans la nuit de mercredi à jeudi dernier, près de 650 drones et 44 missiles russes se sont abattus sur le pays, tuant plus de 20 personnes et en blessant plus d'une centaine. Le président ukrainien avait pourtant proposé de poursuivre le cessez-le-feu au-delà de la fête de Pâques orthodoxe. C'est encore et toujours la Russie qui s'obstine à faire durer sa guerre d'agression. Dans son intervention du 16 avril à l'Assemblée générale, à la suite de l'emploi du veto sur la résolution relative à la sécurisation du détroit d'Ormuz, la Russie a appelé à ne pas cibler les infrastructures civiles et elle s'est félicitée du cessez-le-feu au Moyen-Orient. La Russie se détourne pourtant de cette voie en Ukraine. S'agissant des infrastructures civiles, l'Ukraine a proposé à la Russie un moratoire sur les attaques contre les infrastructures énergétiques. Nous voyons bien sur le terrain la réponse russe à cette proposition. Le droit international humanitaire et ses principes, en particulier ceux de distinction, de précaution et de proportionnalité, doivent s'appliquer en toutes circonstances. Au lieu de s'engager enfin en faveur d'une désescalade, la Russie poursuit donc sa manœuvre d'inversion des responsabilités. Ainsi, elle affecte de s'inquiéter du renforcement des efforts de défense européens. Le 15 avril dernier, le ministre russe des Affaires étrangères mettait en garde contre ce qu'il appelle, et je le cite, « le danger de la militarisation de l'Union européenne ». Le même jour, le ministre russe de la Défense cherchait à intimider les Européens en menaçant leurs bases industrielles et technologiques de défense. Chacun sait la réalité des efforts relatifs de chacun s'agissant de l'effort de défense. Cette rhétorique n'entame ni notre soutien indéfectible à la résistance légitime de l'Ukraine, que je salue, ni notre détermination à contribuer à l'autonomie stratégique européenne. Nous poursuivrons notre aide à l'Ukraine, tant dans un cadre bilatéral que dans un cadre européen toujours plus unifié. Madame la Présidente, des chemins vers la paix existent et il incombe aux membres de ce Conseil d'aider ceux qui veulent les emprunter à le faire. S'agissant d'abord du cessez-le-feu, nous appelons la Russie à se joindre au large consensus international qui réunit le secrétaire général des Nations unies et la grande majorité des États membres issus de tous les continents pour appliquer enfin un cessez-le-feu immédiat, complet et sans condition. La résolution adoptée le 24 février dernier par l'Assemblée générale à une large majorité le demande sans ambiguïté. Il revient à tous les membres de ce Conseil de joindre leurs efforts à ceux du secrétaire général. Quant aux négociations sous l'égide des États-Unis, dont nous continuons à appuyer le principe, il est temps que la Russie s'y engage, non par des faux-semblants et des manœuvres de gesticulation, mais par des engagements concrets. La France entend prendre toute sa part dans la construction de la paix en Europe au travers d'un dialogue de bonne foi. Avec ses partenaires au sein de la coalition des volontaires, elle entend garantir la paix. Elle ne cessera pas d'œuvrer en ce sens. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to start by thanking Assistant Secretary General Kari and Assistant Secretary General Moussouia for their comprehensive and insightful remarks. I also welcome the presence of Ukraine in this meeting. Madam President, Greece, along with the overwhelming majority of the UN membership, has repeatedly called on Russia to put an end to its war of aggression against Ukraine. In full respect of international law, including the UN Charter, international humanitarian and human rights law, it is regrettable that these calls have been ignored by Russia. Official UN numbers have once more dimmed our hope for peace. As we have just heard by our briefers, casualties in Ukraine keep increasing. March was the deadliest month for civilians since last July, and casualties in the first quarter rose by 20% compared with last year, which had already registered more casualties than in the year before. And once more, casualties among children number in the dozens. March also marked a record high in the use of aerial weapons against Ukraine, which constitutes the primary cause of civilian casualties. Even worse, the outlook for this month is also bleak, with dozens of civilians dead and hundreds injured. Time and time again, we have condemned in the strongest terms the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian and critical infrastructure as a serious violation of international humanitarian law. We reiterate the same point today. Thousands of Ukrainians have left their homes also this year, as their lives are upended by war. International humanitarian law dictates that all parties to conflicts must take every possible measure to spare civilians from harm and to protect them as they go about their daily lives. We also call on Russia to end violations of international humanitarian rights law and international humanitarian law regarding forcible transfers and deportation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, as verified in the latest OHCHR report. On the issue of the deportation and unlawful transfer of Ukrainian children, we welcome the recent visit of the SRSG for Children and Armed Conflict to Kiev. And we call on Russia to ensure their safe and unconditional return to Ukraine pursuant to the General Assembly resolution adopted last December. Madam President, peace in Ukraine is long overdue. Greece supports all diplomatic efforts to achieve peace. We also welcome the US facilitated direct peace talks, which have yet to resume since February. Signs of bilateral engagement, direct or indirect, with regard to the latest exchange of prisoners of war on April 11 are of course very welcome, but not sufficient. We call for the next steps of this engagement, starting with a full ceasefire as necessary first step towards a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. A peace that will be firmly based on international law and the UN Charter and in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, within its international recognized borders, rejecting any change of borders as a result of the use of force. Lastly, Madam President, we emphasize that no peace agreement can be viable without the full consent of Ukraine and the direct involvement of Europe, and without credible and enforceable security guarantees to prevent the recurrence of war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I will be brief, intentionally so. After years of meetings, length is no longer our problem. Clarity is. The lack of a resolution is. Talking at one another has reached its limits. Reasoning with one another has not. I thank my colleagues who joined in requesting this briefing. I'd also thank Mr. Khalid Kari, Assistant Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs and Peace Operations, as well as Ms. Joyce Msuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, for their briefings. I welcome the distinguished permanent representative of Ukraine to the chambers. Madam President, more than 4 years into this war, we continue to meet with familiarity. Yet, the facts before us grow heavier, not fewer. As we just heard, The fighting persists. The human suffering worsens. Claims of military progress multiply. Civilian loss accumulates. If momentum is asserted by all and protection is delivered by none, then repetition has become the order of the day to replace purpose. Critical infrastructure is not merely damaged, it is repeatedly disabled. Energy systems are struck. Water systems are rendered unreliable. Cities are left in mourning. This cannot be understood as incidental harm. Children are bearing the deepest cost, not only through death or injury, but through time itself. Schooling interrupted, care interrupted, and lives shaped by instability rather than by choice. Recent declarations of restraint have offered no relief on the ground. What has been presented as pause has coincided with continued strikes. What has been described as openness to peace has produced no corresponding protection for civilians. These contradictions matter not rhetorically, but legally and institutionally. International humanitarian law does not permit deliberate or indiscriminate attacks on civilians. This council cannot preserve credibility by acknowledging war and human suffering while treating its continuation as inevitable. Liberia draws from hard experience. When peace is delayed, restraint becomes more, not less urgent. When resolution is blocked, harm must still be constrained. Because territory asserted through ruins proves nothing, strength demonstrated through suffering proves nothing. And endurance, mistaken for strategy, proves nothing at all. Madam President, if this council cannot bring the war to an end, it must still insist that its human cost, which the briefers have reminded us about today, is neither acceptable nor unchangeable. To do otherwise is not neutrality, it is withdrawal from responsibility. That is a line that this council should not cross. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank ASG Chiari and ASG Msuya for their briefings, and I welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Ukraine at our meeting today. President, the Council meets today because Russia continues to violate the Charter it is bound to erase another state's identity. In recent weeks, Russia has continued to subject Ukrainian cities to drone and missile strikes in 17 civilians were killed and at least 98 more injured in an attack involving 659 drones and 44 missiles. Despite talk, launched more than 200 drones a day on average, exceeding even March's record levels. a full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire and that is what the General Assembly called for just a few weeks ago. Russia has been with Iran. This is an operational relationship that results in weapons and weapons technology from Ukraine to the Middle East in direct solutions. The result of this war will have if Russia succeeds in showing the world, it sets a very dangerous example. In Ukraine, Russia is the aggressor. Must de-escalate, that must engage in meaningful dialogue. Will shape not only the outcome in Ukraine, but the rule.
I thank the representative of the to the representative of Colombia.
Por la convocatoria de esta sesión. Agradezco al de Consolidación de Paz y Operaciones de Paz de Naciones Unidas Humanitario y Coordinadora Adjunta del Socorro de Emergencia nos acompañan a la sesión de hoy. Un impacto devastador sobre la población civil internacional humanitario. Los ataques de la semana, incluyendo un niño, y resultaron, afectados escuelas en ciudades como Odessa, Kherson, violaciones. Expresamos nuestra más Este patrón persiste y se ve reflejado en el pasado mes de marzo, que casi duplicaron las registraciones. De profunda preocupación, la evolución cada vez más dominada por el uso de drones y de prolongar e intensificar el sufrimiento humano. En los términos más enérgicos, los ataques contra civiles, ambulancias, personal sanitario, viviendas, están estrictamente prohibidos por el DIH. A todas las partes su obligación de respetar para su supervivencia. Exigimos el cese. Colombia ha tomado nota del cese al fuego. La tregua representa una oportunidad para avanzar hacia la paz. El reciente intercambio de 175 mediación de los Emiratos Árabes Unidos. Este muestra que incluso en medio de la confrontación es posible confianza. Subrayamos la importancia de estos construir la confianza y para robustecer las vías de lamentamos que el cese haya sido limitado en el tiempo mediante asaltos, bombardeos y ataques con los esfuerzos para lograr una solución que conduzca a un acuerdo de paz negociado directamente por la señora presidenta. Colombia reitera una vez más su conflicto y por sus consecuencias. Dado y completo, y hoy reiteramos ese llamado confirmado. Diplomacia, ampliar los esfuerzos de mediación y a priorizar la protección de la población civil. Es posible avanzar con pasos firmes hacia el fin. Muchas gracias.
I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
ASG Khaled Khiari and ASG Joyce Musaya for their remains profoundly concerned by the continued deterioration of both security serve only to prolong human and the preservation of schools, hospitals, and homes are enshrined in international humanitarian law. My delegation reiterates that all parties must prioritize de-escalation, exercise utmost restraint, and uphold these principles without exception. Madam President, in this spirit, we welcome the continued exchange of prisoners of war, including the recent repatriation of 175 individuals. Such humanitarian milestones serve as essential confidence-building measures and remind us that amidst of a deep division, cooperation remains possible. We remain convinced that there is no military solution to this conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the sole viable means to bring this crisis to an end. In this regard, we note the ongoing international diplomatic initiatives, including those led by the United States. These engagements represent vital steps toward de-escalation, and we hope they will lay the ground for a constructive and durable path forward. Madam President, a durable and just resolution must address the underlying root causes of the conflict and be consistent with the purpose and principles of the United Nations Charter. Lasting peace will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and shared vision of common and sustainable security. In closing, Madam President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability. The people of Ukraine and all those affected by this conflict deserve a future defined by prosperity and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
And we saw negotiations produce concrete results less than 75 prisoners and additional civilians. The United States will fund a $25 million to aid the return of these Ukrainian children forcibly transferred or deported to Russia or Russian-controlled territories. Our dedication to the safe return of those children remains unwavering. The United States continues to reinforce the need for global support for President Trump's efforts to advance durable peace. The United States remains committed to shared prosperity, including through our commitment to the U.S.-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund, which represents the United States' economic stake in securing a free, peaceful, and sovereign future for Ukraine. We call on all UN member states to play a constructive role in bringing this war to an end, including by ending support that enables Russia's prosecution of this war and encouraging both sides toward negotiated settlement. Specifically, we urge China to immediately stop supplying Russia the dual-use goods and material components that enable its war effort. The DPRK must also stop providing munitions, including ballistic missiles, to Russia for use against Ukraine, which violates UN Security Council Resolutions 1718 and 1874 that Russia itself voted for. Iran provides yet another example, as it has supplied Russia with hundreds of attack UAVs and UAV technology for use in Ukraine, including transfers before October 2023 in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. And in September of 2024, Iran began delivering hundreds of close-range ballistic missiles to Russia. Nor should the Council forget that Russia has supplied Iran with critical military equipment over the past year, delivering combat aircraft, helicopters, armored vehicles, and other arms, some of which violate UN Security Council Resolution 1929. Russia's military support to Iran endangers the security of the Gulf cooperation countries. We call on Russia to abide by the resolutions of this Council as a permanent member and encourage both Russia and Ukraine to negotiate a durable end to the war. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Agradecemos al Secretario General Adjunto Khaled Khiari y a la señora Joyce Msuya, Secretaria General Adjunta de Asuntos Humanitarios, por su valiosa información de la situación sobre el terreno. Reconocemos, además, la participación de las distinguidas delegaciones que nos acompañan hoy en sala. Panamá expresa su profunda frustración ante la falta de avances reales hacia el fin de este conflicto. Resulta cada vez más difícil justificar ante quienes sufren esta guerra que la comunidad internacional continúe reuniéndose para describir una tragedia que perdura desde hace ya 4 años. Sesión tras sesión, analizamos cifras que reflejan incrementos en las muertes, escuchamos informes y reiteramos nuestras posiciones, mientras que la violencia continúa, se profundiza y la población civil sigue pagando el precio más alto en esta guerra. Esta normalización del sufrimiento es, en sí misma, inaceptable. La urgencia de un cese al fuego debe asumirse como un compromiso inmediato, sostenido y verificable. Hoy, el campo de batalla no distingue entre objetivos militares y civiles. El uso creciente de misiles, drones de largo y corto alcance y ataques masivos contra zonas urbanas demuestra una peligrosa normalización de ataques contra la infraestructura civil. Las cifras más recientes son claras. Desde febrero del 2022, más de 15.000 civiles han perdido la vida y más de 43.000 han resultado heridos. Solo en los primeros meses del 2026, la violencia ha aumentado un 20% respecto al año anterior. Panamá reitera su condena a toda violación del derecho internacional humanitario y de los derechos humanos. Cualquier ataque contra la población civil y el personal humanitario es una grave afrenta a los principios más básicos de humanidad, una realidad que desafortunadamente ya no distingue fronteras. Por otro lado, deseamos subrayar que la protección de la niñez debe mantenerse como una prioridad transversal en todos los contextos del conflicto armado. Los niños y niñas son siempre las víctimas más vulnerables de la guerra. Sufren de desplazamientos forzados, interrupción en su educación, separación familiar, afectaciones a su salud física y mental y riesgos graves de violencia, explotación y reclutamiento. Integrar la protección de la niñez en los esfuerzos diplomáticos, humanitarios y políticos orientados a la paz no es solamente una obligación jurídica, sino también una inversión indispensable para la estabilidad futura de las sociedades afectadas por este conflicto. Ningún proceso de paz puede considerarse sostenible si no colocamos a la niñez en el centro de sus prioridades. Señor presidente, debemos redoblar esfuerzos con el fin de prevenir que este conflicto se convierta en un ejercicio de desgaste indefinido, donde la inercia sustituya a la voluntad política real y donde el sufrimiento humano quede subordinado a cálculos geopolíticos. Panamá reitera su llamado inequívoco. Es momento de pasar de las palabras a los hechos y es preciso avanzar en el diálogo constante basado en el respeto a la soberanía y a la integridad territorial de los estados. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Khaled Khiari and ASG Joyce Masuya for their briefings. The conflict in Ukraine, now into its 5th year, remains a source of consternation for the international community. We remain deeply perturbed by the continuation of hostilities, adding to the misery of those affected by this conflict, and further worsening the already dire humanitarian situation. As we have repeatedly said, such actions not only perpetuate the conflict, but also undermine trust and the ongoing efforts for peace. Protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure is a fundamental obligation and the foundation of the principles of international humanitarian law, which must be upheld fully by all parties. We take positive note of the announcement of an Easter ceasefire by both Russia and Ukraine. We also commend the two sides for the recent exchange of prisoners of war, duly facilitated by the UAE. We view these steps as enablers to create conditions necessary for achieving lasting peace. We encourage both sides to continue to build on this momentum to advance the cause of peace. President, from the outset, Pakistan's position on the Ukraine conflict has been anchored in an unwavering conviction, the supremacy of dialogue as the only viable path for lasting peace. Now, more than ever before, the overwhelming global opinion is on the side of ending this conflict through peaceful means. This can only be achieved through a sustained, meaningful, and structured dialogue. We remain hopeful that the current pause in the dialogue process between Russia and Ukraine is momentary and will resume at an early date. We are also confident that both sides would make full use of the diplomacy, demonstrate genuine political will, and engage meaningfully and constructively to make strides for a just and lasting settlement of this conflict. That is mutually acceptable to all sides, corresponds to the legitimate security interests of the parties, is in line with the UN Charter, international law, and the relevant multilateral agreements. Towards this end, Pakistan stands ready to support all efforts aimed at resolving this issue peacefully in a comprehensive and durable manner. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Madame la Présidente, la République démocratique du Congo salue la convocation de cette réunion d'urgence consacrée à l'Ukraine. Ma délégation remercie Monsieur le sous-secrétaire général Khaled Khiari et Madame la sous-secrétaire générale Joyce Msuya pour leurs exposés. Plus de 1500 jours se sont écoulés sans qu'une résolution durable n'ait pu être trouvée à la guerre en Ukraine. À l'instar des autres États membres du Conseil de sécurité, et particulièrement les A3, la République démocratique du Congo demeure profondément préoccupée par la poursuite des hostilités et par l'aggravation constante de leurs conséquences humaines et matérielles. Au-delà de ses conséquences immédiates, ce conflit continue de produire des effets préoccupants bien au-delà de son théâtre. Il alimente des dynamiques transnationales de violence qui affectent également le continent africain. Madame la Présidente, alors que des signaux encourageants avaient pu être observés à la mi-février en faveur d'une reprise des efforts diplomatiques, force est de constater que cette lueur d'espoir s'est au fil des semaines progressivement éteinte au profit d'une intensification des affrontements. Les faits récemment rapportés au Conseil de sécurité sont sans équivoque. Les dynamiques actuelles traduisent un éloignement préoccupant des perspectives de désescalade à travers la multiplication des frappes, notamment à l'aide de missiles et de drones, ainsi que l'augmentation significative du nombre de victimes civiles. Monsieur le Président, face à cette réalité, il est impératif de rappeler que la poursuite des hostilités engage la responsabilité de toutes les parties. Chaque attaque, chaque riposte, chaque escalade supplémentaire contribue à alourdir un bilan humain déjà tragique et à ancrer davantage ce conflit dans une logique de destruction qui éloigne chaque jour davantage le retour à une coexistence pacifique entre deux nations pourtant sœurs. Des vies humaines sont fauchées au quotidien, des familles disparaissent, des villes se vident. La peur et la précarité sont devenus aujourd'hui le dénominateur commun de toute une génération pour laquelle chaque jour de guerre supplémentaire éloigne de plus en plus toute perspective de paix durable. Monsieur le Président, le choix de la désescalade et de la résolution de cette crise par le dialogue ne peut plus être différé. En effet, la République démocratique du Congo réitère avec constance sa position. Il n'existe pas de solution militaire à ce conflit. Seule une issue politique et diplomatique fondée sur le dialogue, la bonne foi et le respect du droit international humanitaire, ainsi que des principes de la Charte des Nations Unies, permettra de mettre un terme durable à cette crise. Nous appelons à cet effet à un cessez-le-feu effectif et à la stricte observance de tout engagement pris en ce sens. Les violations répétées des initiatives de cessation des hostilités observées récemment ne font que fragiliser davantage les perspectives d'un règlement pacifique du conflit et soulignent l'urgence de restaurer la confiance entre les parties. Monsieur le Président, la protection des civils doit demeurer une priorité absolue. Il est impératif d'épargner les populations civiles ainsi que les infrastructures essentielles, notamment énergétiques, dont la destruction affecte directement les conditions de vie et compromet l'accès aux services de base. Nous rappelons également la nécessité de garantir un accès humanitaire rapide, sûr et sans entrave à toutes les personnes dans le besoin. Enfin, Monsieur le Président, la République démocratique du Congo exhorte toutes les parties à plus de retenue et à privilégier la diplomatie qui demeure la meilleure voie permettant d'instaurer une paix juste et crédible au bénéfice des populations affectées. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Democratic Republic of the Congo. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我感谢基亚利助理秘书长、姆苏亚助理秘书长所造通报。当前国际局势加剧动荡，地区冲突和局部战争此起彼伏，国际社会呼唤和平、谋求发展的声音愈发强烈。乌克兰危机延宕难决，其走向关乎欧洲及世界和平稳定。早日停火止战，实现危机政治解决，是国际社会的共同期盼。结合近期形势及刚才的通报，我谈3点。第一，尽快推动局势降温。前几天，俄罗斯、乌克兰同意在东正教复活节期间停火，共同朝着和平迈出了重要一步。遗憾的是，停火期间，双方都指出对方违反停火安排， 之后又恢复针对彼此的大规模军事攻击，和平之路依然崎岖坎坷。中方希望当事方以和平为重，保持最大程度冷静克制，尽快推动局势降温，早日实现停火止战。第二，坚定守卫人道底线。近期，俄乌开展新一轮交换战俘和阵亡士兵遗体工作，既体现了人道关怀，也有利于增信事宜。另一方面，俄乌双方都有大量平民和民用设施遭袭，加剧了本已严峻的人道局势。中方对此深表忧虑，希望当事方以人民为重，严格遵守国际人道法，遵循必要、区分和对称的原则，保护平民和民用基础设施，减轻平民遭受的苦难。第三，努力推动和谈进程。乌克兰问题的对话之门已经打开，尽管当前谈判势头有所放缓，各方的立场也存在很大分歧，但只要坚持谈下去，就能迎来和平曙光。中方希望所有相关方都参与到和谈进程中来，保持接触对话，不断积累共识，在充分完全遵循联合国宪章原则基础上，消除危机根源，兼顾各方合理安全关切，达成全面、持久、有约束力的和平协议。主席，中方在乌克兰问题上的立场一以贯之，始终以习近平主席提出的4个应该为根本遵循。我们将继续秉持客观公正立场，致力于劝和促谈，同有关各方保持接触沟通，为推动危机政治解决发挥建设性作用。主席，刚才美方老调重弹，散布不实之词，这完全不可接受。我愿再次强调，中国不是危机制造者，也不是当事方。面对危机，我们没有袖手旁观，更没有拱火浇油、借机渔利，而是始终致力于挺货止战、劝和促谈。中方客观公正立场和发挥的建设性作用得到国际社会广泛认同，公道自在人心。我还要明确指出，任何在乌克兰问题上向中国推卸责任、攻击抹黑的做法，都是不负责任的，也是不会得逞的。事实上，自危机爆发以来，长期向战场提供武器，试图延长战争的是美国，不是中国。我们再次敦促美方停止甩锅推责，多为停火止战、劝和促谈发挥积极作用。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, сегодняшнее заседание – это очередное дежавю. Исполнение этого дешевого второсортного спектакля разыгрывается в Совете Безопасности украинской и европейскими делегациями на ежемесячной основе. И причины нам вполне понятны. Во-первых, им нельзя допустить переключения внимания мирового сообщества на другие кризисы. А во-вторых, необходимо скрыть царящие в их собственных рядах панические настроения. Не будет лишним подбодрить самих себя. Зеленский прекрасно сознает, что окончательное скатывание украинской тематики на обочину международной политики в связи с эскалацией на Ближнем Востоке серьезно снижает отдачу от его гастролей по странам Европы. Он, видимо, думал, что сможет бесконечно и без особых усилий выклянчивать деньги у своих западных спонсоров, запугивая их тем, что ВСУ являются единственной преградой на пути России в Европу. Поняв, что агрессия США и Израиля в отношении Ирана и серьезнейшие последствия этого кризиса спутали ему все карты, Зеленский не растерялся и принялся с удвоенным рвением рекламировать боевой опыт ВСУ. Не постеснялся приписать себе несуществующие заслуги по обеспечению безопасности стран Персидского залива. По его словам, цитирую, «Их защита требовала срочной экспертизы, срочного реагирования. Мы это обеспечили. Украинская экспертиза сработала, все это признают. То же самое нужно и в Европе. У наших дипломатов есть и соответствующий запрос от стран Азии. Я поручил все это оперативно проработать». Украинские военные участвуют в консультациях о том, как дальше будет работать Ормузский пролив. Конец цитаты. В этой альтернативной реальности, если вы не знали, киевский режим в одиночку уже разблокировал Ормузский пролив, экспортирует безопасность по всему миру и практически одержал победу над Россией. Все это не более чем плод фантазии проворовавшегося главаря киевского режима, который он пытается продать каждому, кто готов за него заплатить. В первую очередь, неизлечимо больным русофобией и неспособным принимать ответственные решения нынешним европейским лидерам, если их, конечно, можно назвать лидерами, которые продолжают с пеной у рта кричать о своей решимости поддерживать Украину столько, сколько потребуется. Однако ситуация на Украине очень тяжелая. Обычные украинцы отказываются воевать за погрязшее в коррупции руководство страны и уклоняются от службы, дезертируют и дают жестокий отпор военкомам, людоловам из ТЦК и прикнувшим к ним радикальным националистам, которые, по сути, похищают людей в целях восполнения все более возрастающих потерь ВСУ. Охота на украинских мужчин идет средь белого дня. Их вытаскивают из квартиры частных домов, общественного и личного транспорта, из больничных коек, рабочих мест, подстерегают их в аптеках и продуктовых магазинах. Людей калечат, избивают до полусмерти, применяют слезоточивый газ и электрошокеры. Хватают даже инвалидов с серьезными заболеваниями. Такую безопасность Зеленский хочет экспортировать по всему миру. В реальности он экспортирует только наемниковое оружие, которое всплывает в конфликтных точках по всему миру. Ну и, конечно, свои театральные представления, в основном на европейских подмостках. Не можем не прокомментировать обвинения в наш адрес в отношении нарушений объявленного президентом России перемирия по случаю Пасхи. Надеемся, что эта мера все же позволила большому количеству православных людей в спокойной обстановке отметить великий праздник. Киев, разумеется, немедленно бросился обвинять Россию в нарушениях перемирия. Однако российской стороной было зафиксировано не менее 6,5 тысяч нарушений перемирия со стороны украинских вооруженных сил. И это всего лишь за 32 часа его действия, причем ВСУ обстреливали и гражданские объекты. Среди мирных жителей есть погибшие и раненые. Подчеркнем, что эта мера не может никоим образом рассматриваться как пролог к длительному прекращению огня. Россия выступает за достижение долгосрочного и всеобъемлющего регулирования с устранением всех коренных причин конфликта. Здесь не может и не должно быть никаких подмен, паллиативов или заблуждений. Зеленский же и большинство европейских лидеров стремятся не к миру, а к продолжению войны. И это главная причина, по которой украинский кризис до сих пор не урегулирован. И хотя европейские делегации сегодня на камеру льют крокодиловые слезы о многочисленных бедах и испытаниях, выпавших на долю украинского народа, на самом деле его судьба их нисколько не забудет. В конце прошлой недели начальник Генерального штаба Вооруженных сил Бельгии Фредерик Вансина в интервью сказал, что Украина выигрывает время для подготовки европейских стран к войне с Россией. Именно за это Киеву платят деньги, дают кредиты. Простые украинцы – расходный материал. Так, по сути, сказал бельгийский генерал. Однако и их становится все меньше и сложнее отловить. В этой связи европейцами прорабатываются меры по возвращению на Украину беженцев, прежде всего мужчин. Массированно идет развитие в Европе и производство вооружений. Все предпринимается для того, чтобы киевский режим продержался еще 1,5-2 года, но не помешала бы и передышка, чтобы поднакопить силы. Именно это они имеют в виду, когда говорят о прекращении огня. В Киеве нет ни одной здравой политической силы, которая бы смогла противостоять этому людоедскому замыслу, а нынешние украинские главари продолжают слепо исполнять эту волю. Она не только гарантирует их сохранение во власти, но и личное обогащение. Однако итог этого написанного западниками сценария будет весьма трагичным. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Bahrain. بداية أرحب بسعادة السيد خالد خياري مساعد الأمين العام لشؤون الشرق الأوسط وآسيا والمحيط الهادي، والسيدة جويس مسوية مساعد الأمين العام للشؤون الإنسانية ونائب منسق الإغاثة في حالات الطوارئ، وأشكرهما على إحاطتهما القيمة للمجلس اليوم. أصحاب السعادة، تتواصل مشاهد المعاناة الواسعة الناجمة عن الصراع المتواصل في أوكرانيا، وتلقي بظلالها الثقيلة على المدنيين والبنية التحتية، كما سجل شهر مارس ارتفاعا مقلقا في أعداد الضحايا المدنيين بنسبة 49% عن الشهر الماضي. وفي هذا الصدد أود الإشارة للنقاط التالية. أولا، فيما يتعلق بحماية المدنيين، تؤكد مملكة البحرين على أهمية ضمان الحماية الكاملة للمدنيين والعناية المستمرة لتجنيبهم العمليات العسكرية، وألا تكون المنشآت المدنية والبنى التحتية هدفاً للهجمات. كما تجدد مملكة البحرين تأكيدها على أهمية الالتزام بالقانون الدولي بما في ذلك القانون الدولي الإنساني وميثاق الأمم المتحدة. ثانياً، في الجانب الأمني، تأسف مملكة البحرين للانتشار المقلق لاستخدام المسيرات في النزاعات، والتي ارتفعت بنسبة 70% في مارس 2026 مقارنة بشهر مارس 2025، حيث تتسبب بأضرار جسيمة للمنشآت المدنية والحيوية، بالإضافة إلى تهديدها لحياة المدنيين. ولقد رأينا تأثير الهجمات على البنى التحتية الحيوية في عدد من مناطق العالم، منها في منطقة الخليج، حيث استمرت الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية في استهداف البنى التحتية الحيوية والأعيان المدنية، بما يشكل تهديداً خطيراً وغير مشروع لسلامة المدنيين ولأمن الطاقة وإمدادات الغذاء على الصعيدين الإقليمي والدولي، في تجاهل صارخ لالتزامات إيران بموجب القانون الدولي الإنساني ولإحكام قرار مجلس الأمن 2817 وقرار مجلس حقوق الإنسان رقم 61/1. كما تحذر مملكة البحرين من انتشار استخدام الطائرات المسيرة، والتي قد تصل لجهات غير حكومية، بما يسهم في تفاقم حالة عدم الاستقرار ويشكل تهديداً طويل الأمد للأمن والسلم الدوليين. ثالثاً، على الصعيد الدبلوماسي، تقدر مملكة البحرين جهود كافة الدول التي تبذل جهداً في التوسط من أجل تحقيق الأمن والسلم والاستقرار، الذي يتطلب اهتمامنا وتحركنا الفوري، والعمل على تجنب تصعيد الأزمات في محاولة لإيجاد حل دبلوماسي لها عبر الحوار والمفاوضات. وتأمل مملكة البحرين في إحراز تقدم إيجابي في المفاوضات بين الجانبين الروسي والأوكراني. وفي هذا السياق لا بد من الإشادة بدور الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية والمملكة العربية السعودية ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة ودولة قطر في تيسير مختلف جهود الوساطة التي من شأنها تقريب وجهات النظر بين الجانبين عبر إنهاء الخلافات وتسوية النزاعات بالطرق السلمية لكي يقترب المجتمع الدولي من حلول طال انتظارها تسهم في استقرار القارة الأوروبية وتحافظ على الأمن والاستقرار الدوليين عبر طرح حلول واقعية ومستدامة. في الختام تؤكد مملكة البحرين على ضرورة التوصل لتسوية سياسية ودائمة لإنهاء الحرب الروسية الأوكرانية وتخفيف تداعياتها الإنسانية بما ينسجم مع مبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة وقرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2774 وشكرا لكم. I resume my function as a President of the Council. I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I wish to thank the Presidency of Bahrain for convening this meeting and express my gratitude to the delegates of Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, Liberia, and the UK for supporting Ukraine's request. I further thank the distinguished briefers, Assistant Secretary General Mohammed Khaled Khiari and Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya for their sobering presentations and testimonies. Once again, in this chamber we have heard shocking and unbearable facts of Russia's systematic war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated against the civilian population in Ukraine. All this evidence, so meticulously documented by the UN mission, will, I'm convinced, become a key foundation for future judicial proceedings and the prosecution of all perpetrators of these outrageous crimes. And the moment of accountability will come much sooner than many expect. Regarding the alleged civil victims that the Russian authorities have claimed, I have to stress that these data could not be duly verified by the independent UN bodies. Ukraine does not attack civilians. Mr. President, more than 1,500 days have passed since the beginning of the Russian Federation's full-scale military invasion in Ukraine. The Russian armed forces have continued to deliberately and systematically attack the civilian population of Ukraine and target critical civilian infrastructure using ballistic and cruise missiles, guided aerial bombs, multiple launch rocket systems, and deadly Shahed drones, resulting in significant casualties and destruction. Russian drones hunt civilians like in a vicious video game. They strike ambulances, they hit emergency personnel and firefighters, they hit OCHA staff, as we just heard from the briefing of ASG Msuya. Just between March 30 and April 13, Russia launched over 3,600 strike UAVs, nearly 1,350 guided bombs, and more than 40 missiles against Ukraine, killing at least 70 civilians and injuring more than 400 people. And last week brought no relief from the Russian terror. Moscow used over 2,360 strike UAVs, more than 1,320 guided bombs, and nearly 60 missiles against Ukraine, killing and injuring dozens of innocent people. On April the 14th, a Russian strike on the center of the city of Dnipro claimed the lives of 5 civilians and left 27 others injured. On the night of April 15, Russia carried on one of the deadliest attacks against civilians using more than 700 ballistic and cruise missiles and drones. Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Kherson regions came under massive attack. At least 17 civilians were killed and dozens wounded. Among those killed in the capital was a 12-year-old boy. I could continue this vast catalogue of new Russian war crimes, but regrettably, for some in this chamber, these horrific facts have been reduced to little more than routine wartime statistics and do not evoke the harsh reaction necessary to put Russia in its place. This indifference must end. Mr. President, before I proceed with my statement, I wish to once again briefly debunk the baseless accusations and propaganda that we heard last time and today from the mouth of Russia's representative. To be frank, it is not easy for any person guided by common sense to provide a rational response to these Russian flows of distorted narratives and fabrications. Ignorance in this regard might seem the most natural response to the constant stream of lies that Russia has been spreading in this chamber, also today. But this stance has created the illusion that what the Russian delegation says may have some factual basis, which is completely wrong. So let me expose at least some of the groundless claims that we just heard in Mr. Nebenzia's statement. The delegate of Russia expressed concern that the president of Ukraine is allegedly too worried about the international community's attention shifting to the Middle East and therefore is actively engaging with the countries of the Gulf region. In reality, this assertion reveals something else, namely Russia's complete loss of credibility and growing irrelevance in this region. The truth is that it is Ukraine that is extending a hand of practical assistance to its partners in the Gulf, helping them protect their energy infrastructure from criminal strikes by Iranian drones and missiles supported by Russia. And it is Russia which is the main accomplice of the Tehran regime that has betrayed the Gulf countries, delivered them a knife in the back, and abused its veto right to block a crucial draft resolution on freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz 2 weeks ago. Mr. President, the Russian delegate once again lamented today the alleged difficulties of mobilization in Ukraine, repeating a familiar repertoire of lies. Instead of spreading disinformation about the Ukrainian army aimed at driving a wedge and sowing a division in our society, perhaps Mr. Nebenzia should reflect on the alarming reality inside Russia's armed forces. Since the beginning of this year, Russia has been losing no fewer than 30 to 35,000 soldiers every single month. In fact, Russian battlefield losses have exceeded monthly recruitment plans achieved through contract enlistment. This reveals a growing structural crisis of Russia's manpower system. The Kremlin is increasingly struggling to attract volunteers for its vicious war of aggression despite unprecedented financial incentives. Russian regional authorities are engaged in an unsustainable bidding contest, offering ever higher signing bonuses that far exceed average incomes. Recruitment relies on coercion, pressure on vulnerable social groups, prisoners, migrant workers, recently naturalized citizens, and foreign mercenaries. Newly recruited personnel are sent directly into the high attrition assaults without adequate training. Given the casualty rise, which are unprecedented, recruits from whom Mr. Putin is sending into the mid-grinder on Ukrainian soil face an extremely short life expectancy, measured in weeks or even in days. So before lecturing others, Russia should confront the uncomfortable truth. It is not Ukraine that faces a mobilization crisis. We fight for our homeland. It is Russia that is burning through its own population. Mr. President, in my previous statement, I presented clear evidence of why Russia is going to lose this war because of its disastrous economic situation. Today I will demonstrate why Mr. Putin will fail and be defeated from the military point of view. No army since World War I has paid such an astronomical death toll for such negligible gains as Russia. According to battlefield assessments, Russia is currently losing on average 254 soldiers for every square kilometer of Ukrainian territory it still manages to occupy. To put this into historical perspective, let me remind that during the Winter War of 1939-40, an illegal aggression that was launched by the Soviet Union against Finland, the cost of human lives per square kilometer was roughly 100 times lower. This comparison illustrates a fundamental reality of this war. Russia is achieving minimal territorial gain at an extraordinary high human price. At present, Russia does not control more than 20% of the Donetsk region, territory which Mr. Putin has been demanding in the form of an ultimatum that Ukraine surrender without a fight. This is pure blackmail. We are speaking about 6,000 square kilometers. Russia demands Ukraine to abandon one of the most heavily fortified and logistically developed defensive lines. And we must not forget, first and foremost, that beyond these fortifications, there are cities and villages where Ukrainians live. How can we leave hundreds of thousands of these people to their fate to face barbarians bringing death and destruction? Taking into account the current staggering and appalling rate of Russian losses for every square kilometer of Ukrainian soil, the bloody arithmetic becomes even clearer. The calculation is very simple. Just multiply 6,000 by 254 dead soldiers for each square kilometer. According to this brutal logic of war, in order to seize the whole territory of Donbass, of the Donetsk region, by military means, Mr. Putin would have to send at least another 1.5 million soldiers to their deaths. This mathematics is truly mind-boggling. In practical terms, this would effectively amount to more than doubling Russia's current human losses in this war, bringing the total beyond 3 million casualties. Even for Mr. Putin, for whom the value that he attaches to the life of his own citizens appears to be worth less than a penny or a ruble, such a figure would be catastrophic. That is why the Kremlin turned to the pseudo-negotiation tactics, trying to achieve this goal through diplomatic pressure on Ukraine. But it is not going to work. If one were to apply the current rate of Russian casualties to Mr. Putin's real objective, which is occupying the entire territory of Ukraine, the conclusion becomes almost unimaginable. It would imply that Russia would have to sacrifice over 122 million soldiers to reach this goal. Let me repeat, 122 million soldiers that will have to die in order to achieve Mr. Putin's bizarre dream of conquering Ukraine. And let me remind this Council that Russia's current population is about 140 million, a population already in dramatic demographic decline. It is quite difficult, using all imagination, to describe the expected loss of more than 122 million Russian lives as a glorious victory, isn't it? Besides, as I noted, not without irony in my previous statement, given the snail's pace of Russia's military advances, this inglorious victory would take only 183 years. Well, Mr. Putin seems to be a military genius with this brilliant war strategy, doesn't he? But even he, with all his megalomania, cannot fail to understand this insane objective of capturing the whole of Ukraine is one he will never, ever be able to achieve by military means. So instead of conquering Ukraine, Mr. Putin appears more likely to destroy Russia itself. Against the backdrop of massive military losses, a collapsing economy, and growing internal social turmoil, the territorial disintegration of Russia may become only a matter of time. And it is precisely for this reason that Mr. Putin is raising the stakes in this ferocious game, issuing ultimatums and addressing US mediators, demanding that Ukraine voluntarily withdraw from the Donetsk region as a precondition for any peace talks. I wish to reiterate once and for all that Ukraine rejects any type of ultimatum. We will never, ever abandon a single square millimeter of our soil, and we will never, ever abandon any of our fellow citizens. Mr. President, let me remind the Council that Russia is, at least for the time being, the largest country on the planet with 17.1 million square kilometers. So 6,000 square kilometers of the Donetsk region that Putin wants represent just 0.03% of Russia's territory. I repeat, 0.03%. Can anyone in this chamber explain Russia's obsession with seizing yet another few square kilometers of Ukrainian land? Mr. Putin wants to convince American mediators and the broader international community that peace itself hinges on Ukraine's voluntary surrender of the Donetsk region, and that once this demand is met, Russia will at last be happy and internal peace will follow. Does anyone seriously believe this fairy tale? We don't. What is the purpose of this relentless war of conquest when only about 1% of Russia's vast territory is populated and developed, while the remaining 99% are largely neglected and at best partially exploited for natural resources extraction. Moreover, during the 26-year rule, Mr. Putin has effectively abandoned his population, many of whom still struggle with the most basic standards of sanitation. According to official data, 1/4 of Russian households do not have access to centralized sewage systems or indoor sanitation facilities. In rural areas, the situation is even more severe. In some regions, up to 2/3 of households must rely on outdoor pit latrines. Let us imagine the scale of this absurdity that we are dealing with. On the one hand, Russia demands recognition as a great superpower, claiming the right to redraw state borders by force and impose a new sphere of influence. Yet, on the other hand, around 35 million Russian citizens still rely on outside toilets. Let me repeat, 35 million Russians have no toilet at home. This is roughly the population of Malaysia, Poland, or Saudi Arabia, and comparable to the population of Texas, or almost that of California. Mr. Putin wants Russia to be seen as a respected global player, while living conditions for a huge part of Russia's population remain no better than in the early Middle Ages. This is the true paradox before us. Mr. Putin seeks imperial expansion abroad while failing to secure basic human dignity at home. Mr. President, just a few days ago, we commemorated the sad 4th anniversary of the horrific war crimes committed by Russian soldiers in the occupied city of Bucha, as well as in the neighboring communities during the first months of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. After Russian forces were driven out, more than 450 murdered civilians were found in Bucha alone, men and women executed in the streets, tortured in basements, and buried in mass graves. One of the factors helping to explain the brutality we witnessed in Bucha and other Ukrainian towns under Russian occupation was a deep sense of resentment and hatred described in numerous testimonies and investigation findings. Russian soldiers, many of whom still live in medieval conditions using pit latrines, were confronted with something they had never expected to see. Ordinary Ukrainian families living with dignity in modern homes within communities that they had built with prosperity over 30 years of independence. And it was this encounter that generated additional hostility and fueled rage and barbarity among Russian soldiers. It translated into the gravest atrocities against civilians, shocking the conscience of mankind and standing as one of the darkest chapters of modern history. Mr. President, we call upon our American partners not to weaken, but to strengthen the sanctions regime on Russian energy exports. The recent exemption is expected to generate about $10 billion in additional oil revenues for Russia in April alone. Does anyone believe that these windfall revenues would find schools, hospitals, or maybe sanitation? They will finance Russia's war of annihilation, enough to produce up to 500,000 deadly Shahed drones. Thus, we appeal to our American partners to rely far more on the stick than the carrot in their carrot and stick approach to restore a just and lasting peace. We also urge our European allies to take decisive actions to end once and for all the shameful practice of Russia's shadow fleet, an opaque system that keeps its energy exports flowing. This loophole must finally be closed forever. At the same time, we call upon the countries of the Global South to reconsider their current stance and join the existing regime of coordinated sanctions against Russia's oil, gas, and coal sectors. I also appeal to the Global South. If they cannot support Ukraine with defense weapons, at least they might support the humanitarian program we just heard from the briefing of ASG and Msuya. Each 7 out of 8 Ukrainian in need cannot be reached because of the funding. And I would also like to address our European allies and express Ukraine's gratitude for your staunch support in resisting Russian aggression. This solidarity will go down in history. The fact that the Russian representative in every statement, also today, does not conceal his dissatisfaction with how firmly Europe stands on the side of Kyiv is itself yet another testament to the exceptional nature of this alliance. Let me remind the EU that the EU combined GDP is 11 times larger than that of Russia. At the same time, we call upon our European allies to make another historic step and take a political decision to raise military assistance to Ukraine to the level of 1% of GDP. This would send a powerful signal to Moscow that Mr. Putin has already lost this war. Mr. President, with peace negotiations frozen, de facto frozen by Russia for nearly 2 months now, we are convinced that the Security Council must provide the necessary impetus and move without delay toward the adoption of a new strong resolution. We would particularly appeal to our European friends, members of this Council, to demonstrate leadership commensurate with the seriousness of the momentum and to bring forward a respective draft resolution as soon as possible. I hope some may draw inspiration from the courageous delegation of Bahrain, which, despite strong headwinds and discouragement, showed genuine resolve and ultimately contributed to the adoption of the resolution 2817. If Mr. Putin were serious about the Easter ceasefire proposal, he would not veto a new resolution establishing an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and an exchange of prisoners of war on an all-for-all basis. This new resolution should not be yet another political statement without consequences. It must become a firm instrument of enforcement designed to compel a genuine cessation of hostilities and ensure its implementation. It should be backed by credible measures of pressure, including targeted sanctions in line with the established Security Council practice. Distinguished members, let us not only debate, as we do today and every month, but fully use the competence of this body and finally act. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating again that Russia has no chance to win this war. There is nothing that can save Mr. Putin, not even high oil prices. And I would like to address my Russian colleague, traditionally in Russian language, that was quite literally drilled into us with force in Soviet schools by Moscow rulers. I will do it again, also to lay bare Mr. Putin's fake narrative as if this language were allegedly persecuted or banned in Ukraine, which is not the case. Поздно, Вася, пить боржоми. It's too late to drink borjomi mineral water once the kidneys have failed. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
President, colleagues, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic states, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. Russia's war of aggression is a flagrant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. It is unprovoked and unjustified. It threatens peace and security, not just in Europe, but globally. Russia, a permanent member of the Council that is mandated to uphold international peace and security, acts against the fundamentals of the United Nations and undermines the Security Council. Respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity is not an abstraction. It is the foundation for our global system of collective security. President, Thursday morning, Russia launched nearly 700 drones and missiles against Ukrainian cities in one of the deadliest attacks of the year. The attack reportedly wounded more than 118 people and killed 18. This attack is but one of Russia's many grave violations of international humanitarian law. Russia's war has resulted in immense human suffering, including thousands of civilian deaths, widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure, and severe environmental and economic consequences. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been illegally deported and forcibly transferred, which is only one of Russia's countless war crimes in Ukraine. At the same time, Russia's military campaign has stalled. Ukrainian forces have, in several areas, been pushing back invading troops. Russia has suffered staggering losses in personnel and military material. As Russia fails to meet its objectives on the battlefield, it increasingly seeks to break Ukraine's resilience, not least through systematic targeting of civilian energy infrastructure during the harsh winter months. These efforts have failed. Russia's war of aggression is not merely an assault on a sovereign state, it's an attempt at systematic dismantling of the conditions for civilian life in Ukraine. The brutal violence against civilians, of which 2025 marked a devastating turning point as civilian casualties surged once again, has resulted in over 14 million people being forced to leave their homes. This represents the largest displacement of people in Europe since the Second World War. Russia's lethal violence directed against aid workers, which reached a new high in 2025, show Russia's utter contempt for those who wear the humanitarian emblem. This week, we mark 40 years after the Chernobyl accident. Russia's war of aggression continues to heighten the risk of incidents and radioactive releases at Ukraine's nuclear facilities. Armed attacks on nuclear facilities should never take place and could result in radioactive releases with grave consequences within and beyond the boundaries of the state which has been attacked. President, accountability for Russia's violations of international law is essential for a just and lasting peace. Disregarding international law only encourages further aggression in Ukraine and elsewhere. In this regard, we welcome the significant progress made in establishing a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine and an international claims commission. These mechanisms mark groundbreaking steps toward ensuring accountability for Russia's aggression and reparation for the damage inflicted on Ukraine. President, no one wants peace more than Ukrainians. Since Russia shows no genuine interest in peace whatsoever, we must continue to work together to support Ukraine's effort to resist Russia's aggression. As long as Russia's war of aggression continues, the Nordic countries will remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine and its pursuit of a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sweden for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine remains a serious threat to the international peace and security. Therefore, I want to thank Bahrain for convening this meeting and the briefers for their presentations. Poland aligns itself with the statement to be delivered on behalf of the European Union and its member states. While developments in other regions, including the Middle East, have understandably shifted part of the global attention, this war does not become less dangerous. Every day, Ukrainians are experiencing acts of violence and the brutality of Kremlin. Air raids, bombing, shelling, and destruction of critical and civilian infrastructure remain part of daily reality in one of the largest European countries. Mr. President, Ukraine has demonstrated resilience and a clear readiness to pursue diplomatic solutions. However, Russia continues to show no genuine willingness to engage in meaningful and good faith negotiations. Russia is not seeking peace. It is buying time, over and over again. This points to the need of not reducing, but rather intensifying international engagement. Calling for diplomatic solution is yet not sufficient. The international community's role is also to act in a manner that will persuade Russia to engage in genuine negotiations. The way to change Russia's calculations is to sustain and strengthen economic pressure, including measures targeting Russia's shadow fleet and energy revenues. Pressure is not an escalation. It is the path to creating conditions for a just and lasting peace. The way this war concludes is of the utmost importance for upholding the rules enshrined in the UN Charter. Mr. President, Poland remains a staunch supporter of Ukraine. We do not see it as a charity. It is an investment in global security. In this context, both of our countries will co-host the Ukraine Recovery Conference in the city of Gdańsk in June, bringing together governments, international organizations, and the private sector to coordinate long-term support for Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery. We call on all partners to continue and increase support for Ukraine. Its brave women, men, and children are resisting the aggressor and living under constant threat. They need our understanding, our attention, and our solidarity. I would like to express our appreciation to Vanessa Fraser, SRSG for Children and Armed Conflict, for her steadfast efforts to protect children affected by the war in Ukraine. And in that context, following the presentation by the representative of the US, I would like to applaud the initiative by US administration, including by the First Lady of the US, regarding the fate of Ukrainian forcibly displaced children. To conclude, Mr. President, let me reiterate, only a combination of a strong international support for Ukraine and sustained pressure on Russia will bring about a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Bahrain for convening this meeting to discuss Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which requires continued attention as it evolves already now into its 5th year. And this is very timely, this conversation. Patterns seen in the aggression against Ukraine, such as obstructing the freedom of navigation or the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, were now replicated against the Gulf states. Critical disruptions to global supply chains in the Hormuz Strait recall those before in the Black Sea. Such patterns have critical intertwining points, eloquently explained before around this table, and they are similar in their disregard of international law and the UN Charter. Our answer remains the principled, predictable, and unwavering solidarity in rejecting the aggression against Ukraine. President, this Council and the General Assembly have called for a lasting peace in Ukraine. Unfortunately, Russia continues its aggression, prompting repeatedly a question about its genuine will to end its war. The latest attacks, including the brutal ones during the night of 15th-16th of April, which we strongly condemn, speak volumes. Its missiles and drones relentlessly target civilians and civilian infrastructure across Ukraine, killing and injuring people in disregard for innocent human life. Civilian casualties are on the rise in the past weeks and months. Children's lives have been again lost in recent attacks. Nothing can justify such a conduct, which is unacceptable under international humanitarian law. We continue to voice concerns about regional and global consequences as Russia keeps targeting Ukraine's Black Sea and Danube port infrastructure. These support critical grain supply routes worldwide, even more so now as agri-food systems globally are additionally impacted by the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. In 5 instances this month, such irresponsible attacks in the close proximity of Ukraine's fluvial border with Romania prompted aerial alerts in the Romanian county of Tulcea and response measures to monitor the risk of drone intrusions in our national airspace. We strongly condemn such reckless actions. As we have just commemorated the victims of atrocities committed 4 years ago in Bucha, the aggressor must not be rewarded with impunity for the loss of life and damages committed. We support ensuring justice through accountability mechanisms, such as the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, the Register of Damage for Ukraine, and the International Claims Commission for Ukraine. Those Ukrainian children who have been unlawfully deported or forcibly transferred to Russia must be returned. President, Russia has yet to match Ukraine's proven commitment to peace, to agree to an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire, and to meaningfully engage in negotiations towards a just and lasting peace. Increased pressure on Russia, including through sanctions, and our unwavering support to Ukraine can bring this war closer to its end. We support ongoing diplomatic efforts and a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with UN Charter and the principle of sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity applicable to all nations. In face of an aggressor with a historic record of relapsing into breaches of international law, robust and workable security guarantees for Ukraine are the element that will define a credible and lasting peace. The conditions of a peace in Ukraine concern the security and prosperity of all, and we reiterate our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. As President Dan of Romania and President Zelensky of Ukraine discussed last month in Bucharest, Romania stands with Ukraine and its people for as long as it is needed in their legitimate self-defense against the aggressor and in the exercise of their sovereign right to freely choose their future. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Romania for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic states, and we align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. Once again, we are meeting to voice our condemnation of Russia's ongoing brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. We highly value the efforts of the UN agencies as well as the leadership of the UN Residential Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator Matthias Schmaler for their essential role in supporting affected Ukrainian civilians and helping to rebuild destroyed infrastructure. We also commend the vital work carried out by local volunteers and humanitarian workers. Russia is continuing its war of terror despite repeated calls for peace, including Resolution 2774, adopted by this Security Council, numerous resolutions of the General Assembly, and the decisions of the International Court of Justice. Despite the resource drain, numerous casualties, and equipment losses, Russia refuses to hear the voice of the international community calling for a ceasefire. Any proclaimed halt in hostilities is repeatedly violated by Russia, demonstrating its continued lack of genuine commitment to peace. At the beginning of this month, Russia vetoed a Security Council resolution demanding that Iran stops its attacks against civilians in neighboring Gulf states. This comes as no surprise, given Russia's support for and backing of numerous undemocratic regimes across the globe. Russia provides crucial intelligence support to Iran, aiding its campaign of terror across the Middle East. In turn, Iran supports Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine by supplying military technologies used to destroy cities and kill innocent civilians. Supported by Belarus, the DPRK, and Iran, and fueled by illegal oil trade, shadow fleet activity, and the supply of dual-use technologies, Russia continues to perpetrate aggression and generate instability across the world, including through hybrid activities aimed at deception. President, on March 31st, we commemorated the 4th anniversary of the liberation of the town of Bucha, Ukraine. It was there that massive evidence of war crimes committed by Russian forces during the occupation was first revealed. Documented evidence of the executions, torture, conflict-related sexual violence, and the forced transfer of Ukrainian civilians, including children, requires sustained international monitoring, regular reporting, and continued actions by relevant accountability mechanisms. We are particularly alarmed by Russia's continued forced transfer, deportation, indoctrination, and militarization of Ukrainian children. This issue must remain high on the international agenda. Without justice for the victims of atrocities, there can be no just and lasting peace. Recent attacks on civilians in Ukrainian cities, killing at least 18 people and injuring more than 100, further demonstrate Russia's deliberate and systematic targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The Baltic states will never agree to overlook Russia's atrocities committed in Ukraine. We reaffirm our full support for Ukraine in standing up to Russia's terror and call on the international community to maintain pressure on Russia to comply with the demand for a just peace. We will continue to call for full accountability and for the implementation of the International Criminal Court arrest warrants issued against Russian political and military leadership, including Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, in connection with the war crimes of child abduction during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Baltic states call on all partners to support the establishment and the speedy activation of the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. This is not only about justice for Ukraine, it is about upholding the fundamental principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty, territorial integrity, and accountability for breaches of international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for the statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Hida Samson, Deputy Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, President. I thank the Bahraini Presidency for convening this meeting, and I thank the briefers for their updates. I have the honor to make the statement on behalf of the European Union and its 27 member states. the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, Republic of Moldova, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Andorra and Monaco, align themselves with this statement. President, we have now entered the 5th year of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. 1,500 days of conflict, destruction, and civilian losses. Only last week, a new wave of Russian missiles and drones targeted civilians in Kiev, Dnipro, Cherkasy, Sloviansk, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv. In Kharkiv, Russia targeted the Pecheny Dam with 6 guided aerial bombs at the moment of peak seasonal water levels. If successful, the strike would have caused catastrophic downstream flooding, reminiscent of the blowing up of the Kakhovka Dam under Russian control in 2023. This Council must unequivocally condemn Russia for systematically and deliberately targeting Ukraine's civilian and energy infrastructure and bring diplomatic pressure to bear to make it stop. Beyond all else, this war needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. I reiterate the EU's strong support for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law, and underpinned by robust and credible security guarantees for Ukraine. The EU supports diplomatic efforts to bring the war to an end, and they need to be stepped up without delay. Russia must finally agree to a full, unconditional, and immediate ceasefire and engage in meaningful negotiations towards a just and lasting peace. The EU calls on all members of this Council to join us in urging Russia to do so. For peace to be just and lasting, respect for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity is the cornerstone. Borders must not be changed by force. The aggressor cannot be rewarded, and Ukraine's long-term security and ability to defend itself must be guaranteed. We are prepared to contribute to robust and credible security guarantees for Ukraine, notably through the Coalition of the Willing and in cooperation with the United States. The European Union also urges all countries, including all members of this Council, to immediately cease any assistance to Russia in its war of aggression, whether direct or indirect, and notably through the provision of dual-use goods and components. In the context of Iran's indiscriminate military strikes against countries in the region, the EU welcomes Ukraine's readiness to provide support and expertise in air defense and counter-drone systems to Gulf countries, based on its ample experience in defending itself from the same Iranian-developed Shahad drones that Iran has been transferring to Russia. I reiterate the EU's urgent call on Russia and Belarus to immediately ensure the safe and conditional return to Ukraine of all unlawfully deported and transferred Ukrainian children and other civilians, in light of the decision of the General Assembly decision last December to redouble efforts to return Ukrainian children. We welcome the recent visit of the SRSG for children in armed conflict to Kiev in this regard, and we look forward to hearing from the UN about its efforts. President, I also reaffirm the EU's commitment to ensuring full accountability for war crimes and the other most serious crimes committed in connection with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And in this context, the EU welcomes recent steps forward and calls to continue to sustain efforts within the framework of the Council of Europe towards the operationalization of the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine and the establishment of the International Claims Commission for Ukraine. The EU also welcomes the recent renewal of the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine by the Human Rights Council. The future of Ukraine and its citizens lies within the European Union. We will continue to provide, in coordination with like-minded partners and allies, comprehensive political, financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people, in line with its inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. I thank you, President.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Simons for her statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.